The sky above Germany in 1943 was a battlefield of smoke and steel. At 20,000 feet, the cold cut through oxygen masks as frost formed on bomber windows. Below, columns of black flak blossomed like poisonous flowers, each burst rocking the American bombers in midair. Against this backdrop, the steady drone of four Wright Cyclone engines carried formations of B-17 flying fortresses toward the heart of the Reich. The Luftwaffe had once scoffed at these aircraft. German pilots called them Fliegen Sarge, flying coffins. To them, the lumbering bombers were little more than targets waiting to be cut apart by Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s. In their eyes, American planners had sent young crews to certain death, packed tightly into machines too slow, too heavy, and too rigid to survive in the unforgiving skies of Europe. But as the contrails of hundreds of bombers stretched across the horizon, the nickname began to lose its sting. The Flying Fortress, though vulnerable, had a tenacity that defied expectation. Even when pounded by cannon fire, riddled with holes, or engulfed in smoke, many continued to fly. German pilots who had mocked the design soon found themselves making repeated passes, expending precious ammunition, and still failing to bring some fortresses down. Inside the bombers, the reality of war was brutal. Waist gunners stood at their stations, hands frozen to machine gun grips, eyes straining against the glare of sunlight on aluminum. They fired into swarms of attacking fighters, tracer rounds streaking through the sky. Bombardiers in the nose watched the target draw closer, while engineers in the radio room relayed urgent damage reports. One crewman later recalled how the aircraft seemed to shake apart with every hit, but somehow held together just long enough to bring us home. For the Luftwaffe, these encounters were both triumph and tragedy. German aces claimed dozens of bombers on single missions, but their own squadrons were bleeding. Each fortress down often came at the cost of another irreplaceable veteran pilot. The Reich's aircraft factories could produce new machines, but not new men at the pace the war demanded. For the Americans, survival was measured in numbers. Loss rates sometimes reached 20% or more, leaving airfields in England lined with empty revetments where aircraft had once stood. Yet every fortress that pressed on meant more bombs falling on rail yards, ball-bearing factories, and oil plants, the arteries of Germany's war machine. The clash in the skies became a war of endurance. The Luftwaffe's dismissive nickname, one to cruel taunt, began to sound like an admission. The B-17 might have been a coffin to the men inside, but to the enemy it was also a fortress, unyielding, relentless, and costly to challenge. As the formations pushed deeper into Germany that year, the stakes grew higher. Victory or failure would not be decided in a single raid, but in the grinding attrition of missions flown day after day, week after week. The air war over Europe had entered its most brutal phase, and the fate of both sides hung in the balance. The Luftwaffe's contempt had set the stage. Now, the coming battles would prove whether the flying coffins were truly doomed, or whether they would instead become the engines of Germany's destruction. The gamble began long before the first B-17s thundered across the channel. In the 1930s, the U.S. Army Air Corps embraced a bold doctrine that wars could be won not by attrition in the trenches, but by striking at the enemy's industrial heart. Precision bombing, they believed, would cripple war-making capacity and spare the need for another ground war like 1914. It was an idea born of optimism, theory, and faith in the machine. The Boeing B-17, unveiled in 1935, was to be the instrument of this vision. With a sleek fuselage for Wright Cyclone engines and a wingspan of 103 feet, it dwarfed most contemporary bombers. More importantly, it carried up to 13.50 caliber Browning machine guns. From its nose turret to the tail gun, from the waist windows to the top turret, the fortress seemed built to repel any attacker. Its skin of aluminum and its formidable firepower led planners to believe it could fight its way to the target and back without escorts. American strategists were confident. They had studied German rearmament and knew that destroying factories, oil refineries, and transport hubs could unravel the Reich's war effort. Ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, synthetic fuel refineries in the Ruhr, and rail yards at Hamburg all appeared on target maps long before the first bomb was dropped. The Air Corps, reorganized as the U.S. Army Air Forces in 1941, promised that formations of these bombers, hundreds flying in tight combat boxes, could defend themselves with interlocking arcs of fire. German intelligence was less impressed. Luftwaffe commanders derided the notion that bombers could operate in daylight without fighter cover. In their eyes, no matter how many machine guns bristled from its frame, the B-17 remained a slow target, visible from miles away. One Luftwaffe officer reportedly joked that the Americans were sending their men into the skies in flying coffins of their own design, yet the Americans pressed on. The gamble was backed not only by doctrine, but by industry. By 1943, American factories were producing B-17s at astonishing speed, nearly 500 a month at the peak. Lines of fresh aircraft rolled out of Boeing's Seattle plant, Douglas's Long Beach assembly halls, and Lockheed Vegas, California factories. Each represented both technological prowess and a wager that industrial output could overcome combat attrition. Inside the cockpits and crew compartments, optimism met reality. Crews trained in the United States were told that their fortresses were nearly invincible. They learned how to fly in tight formations, relying on the guns of neighboring bombers as much as their own. Waist gunners drilled endlessly, sweeping their barrels across imagined skies. Bombardiers studied the Norden bomb sight, promised as a device that could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. But theory was soon tested by experience. In August 1942, 12 B-17s launched from Britain to strike the railway marshalling yards at Rouen, France. It was the first American daylight bombing mission over Europe. The crews returned jubilant, their losses nil, their faith in the doctrine intact. The newspapers hailed the raid as proof that the bomber was supreme. But as missions grew larger and targets deeper inside Germany, the optimism would fade. Still, in 1943, the doctrine held sway. The gamble of daylight precision bombing had become national strategy. To dismantle Germany's war machine, the United States was willing to risk its own. The Flying Fortress was not just a bomber, it was the embodiment of American faith in firepower, industry, and resolve. The question that loomed over every mission was whether that faith could endure against the storms of steel awaiting in German skies. By the summer of 1943, the United States Army Air Forces were ready to test their daylight bombing doctrine against the heart of Hitler's war machine. The targets chosen were bold. Regensburg, home to the Messerschmitt factories producing the Bf-109, Germany's most prolific fighter, and Schweinfurt, whose ball-bearing plant supplied nearly every moving part in the Reich's military arsenal. The logic was simple. Cripple aircraft production stalled Germany's war effort. But the gamble came at a staggering cost. On the morning of August 17, 1943, 376 B-17 Flying Fortresses lifted off from bases across England. Their objective was to strike both targets in a coordinated double blow. The Regensburg force, numbering 146 bombers, was to continue on to North Africa after hitting the Messerschmitt plants. The larger force of 230 would strike Schweinfurt and return to England. It was a plan that demanded precision timing, but delays and weather disrupted the schedule. Instead of hammer and anvil strike, the raids unfolded hours apart, giving the Luftwaffe time to regroup between assaults. As the formations crossed into German airspace, black puffs of flak burst around them. The bombers pressed on, bristling with guns, their tight combat boxes meant to create walls of firepower. But waiting for them were waves of Luftwaffe fighters, Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s, fresh from their bases. The Germans attacked relentlessly, darting through formations, firing cannon shells that tore through engines and wings. Eyewitnesses later recalled the terror inside the formations. One crewman described how planes seemed to explode all around us, just fireballs spinning down. Waist gunners fired until barrels glowed red, yet still the enemy came. Crews watched as bombers beside them disintegrated in midair, men parachuting into burning sky or trapped in wreckage plunging to earth. At Regensburg, the B-17s pressed their attack despite mounting losses. Bombs rained down on the Messerschmitt factories, damaging assembly halls and workshops. Yet the cost was devastating. Of the 146 fortresses dispatched, 24 were lost before they even reached North Africa. The survivors, low on fuel and battered, limped southward, some crash landing along the way. Schweinfurt proved no less brutal. German fighters struck in coordinated waves, forcing gunners to fire in every direction at once. Bombs did hit the ball-bearing plants, causing significant damage and disrupting production. But the price was catastrophic. Of the 230 bombers sent, 36 never returned to England. Nearly 1 in 5 fortresses failed to complete the mission. Hundreds of airmen were killed, wounded, or captured. The Luftwaffe celebrated what appeared to be a stunning victory. German pilots posed for photographs beside their machines, boasting of dozens of American bombers destroyed. But beneath the triumph lay an uncomfortable truth. Their own losses were mounting. Dozens of experienced pilots had been killed or wounded that same day. Unlike the Americans, whose factories replaced bombers at an industrial pace, Germany could not easily replace the skill and experience of its flyers. One Luftwaffe officer admitted privately that while they had bloodied the Americans, the cost of such battles was slowly bleeding the Reich's Air Force. For the U.S. Army Air Forces, Schweinfurt and Regensburg were both a baptism of fire and a sobering lesson. The doctrine of unescorted daylight raids had been tested, and the results were undeniable. Even the Flying Fortress, bristling with guns, could not survive deep penetrations into Germany without long-range escort fighters. The losses were unsustainable. Yet the missions also proved that the Americans had the will to press forward, striking at the very heart of German industry despite the risks. The charred wrecks across Bavarian fields and the long list of missing crews etched a grim reality into American command. The bomber gamble was not enough on its own. To win the skies over Germany, the Americans would need something more, and soon. The skies over Europe in 1943 and 1944 became a proving ground for both men and machines. For the crews of the B-17 Flying Fortress, every mission was a gamble with death. Yet amid the devastating losses of Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and countless other raids, a new reputation began to form, one of almost mythical resilience. The bomber once mocked as a flying coffin became, instead, a symbol of steel endurance. Stories spread quickly across airfields in Britain. Tales of fortresses staggering home on 3 engines, sometimes even 2, circulated among exhausted crews. One aircraft, riddled with more than 200 bullet holes, landed with its vertical stabilizer nearly shredded away. Another returned with its nose blown off, the bombardier dead, and the pilot half-conscious from blood loss, yet the co-pilot managed to bring it safely onto the runway. Mechanics shook their heads in disbelief as they examined twisted airframes that by all logic should have fallen from the sky. Inside the bomber, survival demanded superhuman endurance. Gunners fired from exposed plexiglass turrets, where temperatures at 25,000 feet plunged to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Oxygen masks often froze, leaving men gasping for air as frost crept across their goggles. In the waist positions, shattered windows left gunners buffeted by freezing winds, their gloved hands stiff as they gripped .50 caliber machine guns. "We were flying inside a block of ice," one crewman later recalled, "but you just kept firing because stopping wasn't an option." German pilots soon realized that the Flying Fortress was no easy kill. A single pass with cannon fire might cripple other Allied bombers, but the B-17 often absorbed hit after hit before finally breaking apart. Luftwaffe veterans began to complain in their diaries that bringing down one fortress often required multiple coordinated attacks, draining both time and ammunition. For them, the bomber's resilience turned what seemed like an easy target into a costly and dangerous pursuit. The resilience of the fortress became fuel for propaganda. Newspapers and newsreels carried dramatic photographs of mangled aircraft that still managed to return, their crews climbing out exhausted but alive. These stories bolstered public morale in the United States and Britain, convincing families that their sons had a fighting chance in the hostile skies. More importantly, they reinforced the belief that the Allied bomber offensive, though costly, was both possible and sustainable. At the heart of this legend was not just steel and rivets, but the courage of the men inside. Pilots fought to control crippled aircraft through sheer willpower, guiding their crews back across the channel. Medics treated frostbitten gunners who had kept firing long after their fingers had gone numb. Radio operators tapped out emergency codes as flames licked through fuselages. Survival often came down to teamwork, men refusing to abandon one another even when their aircraft seemed doomed. The B-17's reputation as a fortress of steel changed how both sides saw the air war. For the Allies, it became a rallying point, proof that persistence and resilience could carry them through the storm. For the Germans, it marked a growing frustration, as each fortress that clawed its way back to England was a reminder that the Luftwaffe's dominance in the skies was slipping piece by piece. As the bombing campaign intensified, the flying fortress was no longer seen as a coffin, but as a lifeline, a brutal, freezing, bullet-riddled lifeline that kept its crews alive long enough to fight another day. By the closing months of 1943, the Allied bomber offensive teetered on the edge of collapse. Losses at Schweinfurt and Regensburg had proven that unescorted daylight bombing over Germany came at a price too high to sustain. Crews spoke in hushed tones of mission roulette, where survival seemed a matter of chance more than skill. Without protection, the B-17s and B-24s were easy prey for the disciplined wings of Bf-109s and FW-190s. The flying fortress had earned its reputation for resilience, but even steel and courage had limits. Something had to change. That change came in the form of sleek, fast, and deadly fighters with a range to go the distance. First, the P-38 Lightning and the rugged P-47 Thunderbolt extended protection a little deeper into Europe. But it was the arrival of the P-51 Mustang in late 1943 and early 1944 that transformed the air war. Equipped with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the Mustang could fly higher, faster, and farther than any escort before it, reaching Berlin itself. Suddenly, the bombers no longer faced the gauntlet of German defenses alone. On February 20th, 1944, the Big Week offensive began, targeting Germany's aircraft factories and infrastructure. For the Luftwaffe, it was the beginning of the end. As formations of B-17s pressed toward Leipzig, hundreds of German fighters scrambled to intercept, confident in their tried and tested tactics. Yet waiting for them, just beyond the contrails, were squadrons of Mustangs. They dove into the German ranks with lethal precision, tearing apart formations that had once attacked with impunity. For the bomber crews, the effect was electric. It was the first time we saw fighters on our side stay with us all the way in, one wastegunner later recalled. Instead of counting down minutes until the Luftwaffe struck, we watched Mustangs dive into them before they reached us. It was like the cavalry had come. The psychological impact on the Luftwaffe was devastating. For years, they had dominated their home skies. Now, they found themselves on defensive, hunted in the very airspace they once commanded. On one infamous day, German records noted the destruction of 56 fighters in a single clash, a blow that no air force could easily replace. Worse still, every lost aircraft represented not just hardware, but irreplaceable veteran pilots, the backbone of the Luftwaffe's strength. Veterans recalled their growing despair. Some wrote in diaries that the appearance of Mustangs everywhere at once made survival feel impossible. Others described the frustration of watching bombers continue toward their targets. Seemingly invulnerable now, the escorts had shifted the balance. What the Germans had once called flying coffins had become bait, drawing them into battles where the hunters became the hunted. For the U.S. Army Air Forces, the arrival of long-range escorts validated their strategy. The bombers, with their heavy defensive armament, could now hold formation while the Mustangs swept the skies clear. Precision attacks on oil refineries, rail junctions, and ball-bearing plants began to cripple Germany's war economy. The Luftwaffe, forced to rise and fight, bled itself dry against the combined strength of fortress formations and Mustang squadrons. By the summer of 1944, the shift was undeniable. Where once American bombers had staggered home alone, now they returned with fighter escorts still circling protectively above. Luftwaffe dominance, once feared by every Allied crewman crossing the Channel, had crumbled under the relentless pressure of attrition. The turning point had come. The Allies had not only seized the skies, but had turned the very concept of the flying coffin into a trap, one that consumed the Luftwaffe in a war of exhaustion it could never win. By 1944, the air war over Europe had transformed into a relentless storm. Where once a few dozen B-17s had ventured timidly into enemy skies, now fleets numbering in the hundreds, sometimes more than 1,000, stretched from horizon to horizon. Their contrails laced the heavens in endless white scars, and below, the very earth of Germany shook beneath their fury. Industrial cities such as Hamburg, Cologne, and Essen became familiar names in the bomber crew's mission briefings. The Ruhr Valley, once the beating heart of German steel and armament production, was pounded until smoke and flames seemed permanent fixtures on its skyline. Entire districts vanished under cascading waves of high explosives and incendiaries. Synthetic fuel plants, vital to keeping the Wehrmacht panzers moving and the Luftwaffe flying, became prime targets. Without oil, even Germany's most advanced weapons were useless. For the civilians on the ground, the scale was apocalyptic. Survivors of Hamburg's firestorm remember the sky, glowing red as daylight turned to night. Others describe the earth trembling as if in an earthquake, windows shattering from concussive blasts miles away. A resident of Cologne later wrote that the roar of engines above sounded like a ceiling collapsing over the world. Each raid carried not only destruction, but also a psychological weight that gnawed at the foundations of morale. Yet the devastation was not only physical. In the command post of the Luftwaffe, despair began to take root. Fighter commanders reviewed reports with growing horror. Their once proud Jagdgeschwader were dwindling, their veterans falling faster than they could be replaced. One officer admitted bitterly that they were throwing boys into the sky against steel giants. What had begun as a defensive battle to repel invaders had turned into a war of attrition Germany could not hope to win. The Luftwaffe's predicament was worsened by the arrival of long-range escorts. P-51 Mustangs, circling high above, ensured that the bombers no longer flew alone. German pilots, once confident in their ability to carve through formations, now faced swarms of enemy fighters hunting them down before they could even reach the bombers. Losses mounted. The Reich's air defenses, once the pride of Europe, were being bled dry with every engagement. For the Americans, the shift was dramatic. What had once been near-suicidal missions in 1943 were now carried out with a grim assurance. Crews still faced flak and occasional desperate fighter attack, but the odds of survival had improved. The sky belonged to us now, one B-17 navigator later recalled. We could see in the way the Germans fought, scattered, frantic, never like before. The statistics told the story with brutal clarity. By late 1944, the U.S. 8th Air Force was launching missions involving over 1,000 heavy bombers in a single day. Rail hubs were obliterated, halting troop movements. Aircraft factories were smashed, leaving the Luftwaffe scrambling for replacements it could no longer produce. Fuel shortages grounded entire squadrons. Even the Wehrmacht on the front lines began to feel the strangling effect. Tanks abandoned for lack of fuel, supply lines severed, reinforcements delayed until it was too late. For the Allies, these victories in the air were more than tactical successes. They were proof that the strategy of daylight precision bombing, once derided as folly, had finally come of age. The flying coffins of 1943 were now the hammer that broke the Reich's ability to wage modern war. And yet, for all their triumph, the cost was still measured in blood. Crews continued to fall, fortresses still spiral from the sky, and families back home received telegrams edged with grief. But unlike in the dark days of Schweinfurt, the losses no longer carried the taste of futility. Every raid now left Germany weaker, every mission another step toward the crumbling of Hitler's war machine. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was broken and bleeding. Its skies were ruled by the very bombers it had mocked, a grim irony that echoed across the burning cities of the Reich. By the spring of 1945, the roar of B-17 engines had become one of the defining sounds of the war in Europe. The Flying Fortress, once dismissed by the Luftwaffe as too slow and too vulnerable, had flown more than 1.5 million sorties across the continent. In their bomb bays, They had carried over 600,000 tons of ordnance, dropped with the relentless regularity of machine-born America's vast industrial capacity. Rail hubs, fuel depots, aircraft factories, and entire cities lay in ruins, the wreckage of a Reich shattered from above. Yet the cost was staggering. Nearly 5,000 fortresses never returned from their missions. Tens of thousands of young Americans, gunners, pilots, bombardiers, and navigators, were killed, captured, or came home scarred from the ordeal. Airfields across England had their cemeteries filled with neat rows of white crosses, silent witnesses to the gamble of daylight bombing. For every triumphant sortie, there were families who received telegrams edged with grief. Still, the B-17 endured in memory not as a failure, but as a paradox, both coffin and fortress. Crews told stories of limping home with half a wing missing, with engines dead and controls barely responsive. One gunner remembered firing his .50 caliber through shattered plexiglass at fighters closing in, his oxygen freezing in the mask as he held the line. These stories became legend, woven into the fabric of Allied morale, and later into history itself. For German veterans, the memory was different but equally searing. Luftwaffe pilots spoke of their shock when, by 1944, swarms of P-51 Mustangs escorted the fortresses all the way to Berlin. The sky was no longer ours, one recalled bitterly. The very bombers they had once mocked as flying coffins had instead drawn them into battles they could not win. Every engagement drained Germany of aircraft and pilots it could not replace, bleeding the Luftwaffe white until its collapse was inevitable. On the ground, German civilians carried their own memories of the fortresses. The droning engines heralded destruction long before the bombs fell. Children huddled in shelters while cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden burned. For them, the B-17 was not just an aircraft, but a symbol of unrelenting pressure, a reminder that the Reich's enemies had resources and endurance beyond imagination. The true legacy of the B-17, however, lay not only in its destructive power, but in what it represented. It was an embodiment of America's belief in daylight precision bombing, in the idea that industry itself could be targeted and strangled. It was also a testament to industrial might. Nearly 13,000 fortresses rolled off production lines, each one a link in a chain that reached from American factories to European battlefields. When the war ended, the flying coffin became an icon. Many continued to serve in new roles: reconnaissance, transport, even humanitarian relief. Some flew supplies to starving populations, their bomb bays now filled with food instead of explosives. Others were immortalized in films, where their silhouette came to symbolize the courage and sacrifice of an entire generation. For veterans, the sight of a fortress in flight stirred emotions that words could rarely capture. For those who had flown them, the B-17 was both a lifeline and a tomb, a machine that could carry men home against impossible odds or consign them to the earth below. For those who had fought against them, it was a shadow that blotted out the sun, the herald of defeat. As history remembered them, the nickname Flying Coffin endured, not as an insult but as a reminder of the price paid in human lives. Each fortress carried 10 men. Each sortie rolled the dice on their survival. And yet, through their sacrifice, the Reich's war machine was broken, its cities left in ruins, its armies starved of fuel and supply. The film closes on a final image: the skies over Germany, 1944. Hundreds of B-17s glint in the sunlight, their formations stretching beyond sight. Below, the shadows of their wings fall across a nation in flames, a stark reminder that war is not won by courage alone, but by endurance, sacrifice, and the overwhelming weight of industry. The flying coffins, once mocked, have become a hammer that shaped history.